Cool.
This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. If you don't know me or haven't met me, my name's Dean Standing, and I'm the Client Services Director here at the Red Group. Today, our webinar is focused on segmentation and such like. This is the third seminar we've had following some work we've done with the DMA on measurement and planning, and has actually been voted by you guys and some of the people that joined us in the last webinar, which is not surprising given the amount of questions that we have on the topic of segmentation, how to approach it, who, what, where, and why to segment, which can often be overwhelming and occasionally off-putting. So, which is a difficult one given the impact that segmentation can have, especially not just within a marketing context, but on a broader transformational, strategic product, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for today, the agenda topics we'll cover off. We're joined by, we're joined by Graham from Ageas, who is our Head of Propositions and Growth, and we'll talk through his case studies and examples of how and where they apply segmentation. But before that, we'll have a bit of a how-to guide on kind of rudimental segmentation with our Customer Engagement Director, Scott Logie, followed up with some questions and Q&A at the end. Okay. So a bit of housekeeping beforehand. We'd kind of like to make the session as interactive as possible. So do tweet, share at hashtag #regsegmentation. If you have any technical issues, please drop it in the chat box at the bottom, and we'll be able to pick that up as quickly as possible. And any questions that you have, please drop those into the Q&A, and we'll filter those through for a discussion at the end. As you may have seen, the session is going to be recorded, and that will be available on our website, I think, as of tomorrow, as is the previous webinars that we've done over the last couple of weeks / months. Cool, thank you. Okay.
Great, thank you very much, Dean.
So I'll hand over to Scott, who'll kind of go through the how-to guide, as we said.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you very much, Dean. So what I'm going to try and do now is put a bit of detail around all the options you face when you start looking at doing a segmentation. It's often quite daunting because there's quite a lot of things to consider. So I'll try and go through this at a reasonable pace, but also cover as many of the sort of things that need to be thought about as I can within the next 20 minutes or so. Many years ago, I actually used to work in a bank as head of insight and data. That was in the days before we called it data science, but same thing really. And the first thing that we did when I worked in that organization was a segmentation. There's lots of reasons why we did so, but the main one really was that we had around 4 million customers at that point, and at that point we were treating everyone the same. So everyone was getting the same marketing, the same communications, the same emails, the same mailings, etc. And what we wanted to know was whether that was the right thing to do or not. And so we built a segmentation, actually turned into a bit of a beast, and we ended up with 104 segments. I don't think I advised that to anyone, but at the time it seemed to make sense. But for me, it was really the best way to help us to look at those 4 million customers in a lot more detail. By being able to get under the skin of who they were, how they engaged with the bank, what products they had, where they lived, how well off they were. All of those things all got distilled down into those segmentations, into those segments, and allowed us to market to those people differently. And since then, I've always been a big fan of segmentation. I think it's a really good way to help organizations get to understand their customers in a bit more detail. And so we thought it'd be useful just to share some of the sort of do's and don'ts around a segmentation before we hear a bit more detail from another example from Graham at Ageas. So this is the agenda that we put together for today. It's quite a lot to cover in 20 minutes, but we'll try and do as best we can by going through in as quick and brisk a manner as we can, but covering as much of this as we can in detail. Okay, so let's get started then and just go on to, a very basic starting point, but right at the beginning, what do we mean by segmentation? For me, this is all about trying to build a bridge between mass marketing to everyone, or more or less everyone, and the utopia of one-to-one marketing. Segmentation creates a middle ground for us where we can group people or companies, because we can do this in a B2B environment as well, who look the same and then treat those groups the same. In mass marketing, we treat everyone the same. In an ideal world, we would treat everyone differently. In a segmentation world, we create a manageable group, and that's really key, I think, is the manageable aspect of it. So a manageable set of groups, and then we can treat the people within those groups as being the same. Of course, that in itself creates a lot of questions. How many groups? What makes them similar? How do we bring them together? All of those things are part of what we're going to cover in the next 20 minutes or so. But that sort of, for me, that whole thing is about the bridge between individual level and the overall company level, and creating that bit in the middle that allows us to understand and to treat those people in the same way. Of course, there are lots and lots of different types of segmentation. And when we talk about people being the same, that in itself is not an easy thing to get right. As such, we need to guide our segmentation to ensure that it works for our business, meets the strategic goals of our organization. Here, we've picked out 5 different ways that we can segment. Every one of these are perfectly valid and are important for different types of businesses or for different strategies. So, for example, if we start on the left-hand side where we have geographic segmentation, this is a segmentation which we base around where people live or indeed where they interact. So it might be digital versus physical, for example. Here we group together people who live close to each other, are in the same region or the same area. So that might be down to store catchment, for example. The very sort of basic segmentation that we all think about is geodemographic segmentations. So things like Mosaic, Acorn, Persononics. Those are really geographic segmentation where we're grouping together people with similar characteristics, but based primarily on where they live or what their postcode is. The second segmentation that we have here is demographic segmentation, which I guess in some ways is where we immediately go. When we think about segmentation, we think very clearly about grouping together people that have the same age band, the same gender, same income, same family status, same social group, that kind of thing. This is a very good way to help organizations get to know the customers or their supporters if you're a charity. And primarily the main reason for doing a sort of demographic segmentation is exactly that, is that you know that there are a broad group of people who are using your products or buying your products. And what you want to know is what the different groups are within that. And a demographic segmentation can help you to divide up people based on their personal details and give you a good insight in terms of who it is that's buying from you. And you can overlay that with products to see how that differs. We then have psychographic segmentation, which is used quite a lot within the charity sector, for example, based really around what motivates people, what their interests are, what their opinions are. Again, in political parties, in the sort of political sphere, this is used quite often as well. This creates the use of a different type of data, because quite often you have to go out and actually carry out a survey to find out what people's opinions are, what their interests are. That then, in essence, allows you to segment around needs and wants rather than around behaviours. Talking of which, we then have behavioural segmentation, which is often used within areas such as retail or finance. And the sort of ethos here is you are what you do, or you are how you behave. So quite a lot of the segmentation that people like Facebook will use will be based on behavioural segmentation. So that's really what you browse, or if you believe that Facebook's listening and watching us all the time, what you say or what you think. But basically what we're looking at there is segmenting people by different types of behaviours. So when they give, how often they give, how much money they give, what they buy, that kind of thing. The most basic sort of behavioural segmentations are things like recency frequency value or recency frequency monetary value, RFM, RFV type segmentations, which are used a lot by lots of different organizations. And then just finally, in terms of our examples, we've got predictive segmentations, which are looking really at what people are likely to do in the future based on what they've done in the past. So that'll look at previous purchase histories, communication histories, which channels people use, what kind of offers they take. But that will take into account past behavior, but then look to predict likely future behavior and then grouping people together based on these likely future behaviors. In reality, we often use a hybrid of all of these different approaches. So things like RFV and LTV might be used from a behavioral point of view, but then overlaid with demographics or even psychographics to create a segmentation that brings into account all of those different types of data. As such, there's quite a lot to consider, but the important thing really is about understanding why you want to do this in the first place and what's driving that segmentation. So before we advise going on to what type of segmentation you want to use, the main thing that we think we should look at really is around the why. So we need to satisfy ourselves with quite a basic question, really, which is, why do we want to do this? I've talked, for example, about using segmentation to target marketing campaigns better as an example, but there's lots and lots of other reasons why people would want to build segmentation. So for example, it could be around looking at the product set that we have as an organization and whether that product set is finding the right market, or whether we should be looking to derive new products to sell to either our customers or to the people that we want to have as our customers in the future. Or it could be around pricing and whether we're creating the right pricing policy for our customers. And maybe that should differ by different regions, which would maybe drive us into more of a geographic type segmentation. Or maybe you want to find out who are your more profitable groups now and in the future to inform what your customer acquisition strategy should be. That's a combination really of behavioral, demographic, and then predictive segmentation. It could even just be that my customer base is really varied, and all I want to know is who they are, so that I can tailor the way that I engage with those people much better and talk to those people in the right way. Generally, if we're working on a segmentation as Red Group, before we start any project, we'll sit down with our clients, we'll work through what we're going to do in terms of outcome, and then we'll make a decision as to what's the best type of segmentation to run. And really the key thing within all of this is to make sure that we understand what the outcome is going to be in terms of what's going to make a business change or a strategic change to the business that we're working with to help them to meet what their end goals are. When we've decided what kind of segmentation we want to run, and indeed why we want to run that segmentation, there's then some techie stuff to be done, obviously. In all honesty, at this stage, you probably want to hand this over to some data analysts, data scientists, the mega geeks within your organization, who can help you to create your segments. But this is really just to give you an idea in terms of the different types of techniques that could be used. And there are lots of other ones out there that people will use to actually build their segmentation as such. I think clustering is probably the sort of most popular segmentation solution. That's where basically we chuck all of the data into a big pot. We allow the, whether that's R or SAS or some of the other tools that are available, to pull together the groups of people who look most similar. What we do from a statistical point of view within that is give some guidance in terms of what the weighting should be to particular variables. So if, for example, we're very keen that age is a main driver within the segmentation, we might upweight age within that segmentation so that age groups becomes a key driver in terms of grouping those people together. In terms of what it's doing in the background, what really it's doing is looking at every person and how close they are based on a different set of measures of distance. So for example, if we're only using age and we had a seed which was people who were 35, then it would measure how close everyone is to the age of 35, and then it would split people up and how closely they align to that particular age band. And what clustering does is to do that in as many dimensions of data as we throw at it. And so you can create segmentations which are, very, very large in terms of number of clusters all the way down to very low. And then there's a bit of a decision to be made in terms of how many clusters we actually pull out of that. Predictive modeling is another technique in terms of to be used in segmentation. And that, in that sense, we tend to know how many clusters we're looking to aim for. So it might be we're trying to create good, bad, and middle ground type customer segments. And therefore we code that up and we allow the predictive models or the regression models to actually classify those particular groups. Random forests, which are driven primarily by machine learning algorithms, are probably a bit more fashionable at the moment. These are a bit more black box because there's a lot more going on under the surface, but there's a lot more in terms of outcomes as a result because there's more computational power, if you like, in those particular solutions. What we're really doing here is creating a set of decision trees that then classify people into different groups, and then we pull together those groups to create our clusters at the end of it. To be honest, each of these has pros and cons. If you talk to a different set of analysts, you'll get a different set of results in terms of which ones they want to use. It really does come down to which one is the right segmentation for your organization at the right time. However, one of the things that really comes out of this is that science doesn't always provide the best answer. I realize that's controversial. But for me, segmentation is a combination of art and science. The science bit is what can lead you to get to sort of like the number of segments you might want to be looking at, but something needs to be overlaid on this, which is common sense, practicality, and usability. So for example, you may create 8 segments that look absolutely beautiful, but are really hard to describe. Whereas if you had a 9-segment solution, which has separated people out in a much more common sense way, that becomes the segmentation that we like to adopt, if you like. So generally what we do is create lots of different segmentation solutions, and then we look at them from 2 points of view. One is how well do they actually segment the data or group the data together? And the second one is how easy are they to interpret and how easy are they to understand? That then helps us with some other points as well further down the line, like ease of adoption, for example. If a segmentation solution is really complex, then no one's going to use it. And so there's no point in actually picking that up and using it. In addition, if we make it too simple, then it becomes something that just doesn't really help us to get under the skin of our customers in a lot of detail. And so you have to really do a bit of moving around to decide which one is the best one to use. One of the things that often comes out at this point is that we might have an 8-segment solution where 7 of them are really lovely and easy to understand, but the 8th one doesn't make any sense. Occasionally, we'll either split those up or take those customers and put them into one of the segments to help us to get to the point of actually something that is very usable and very practical. Once you're at a stage where you're happy with your segments, now make that sound like it's very easy, but I promise you that takes quite a lot of back and forth and quite a lot of time to get to a solution that people are comfortable with. Then there's a few more stages to go in terms of what we do next. The first one really is to look at what we call creating personas, but really what we're looking at here is profiling your segments and trying to get under the skin as to why these people have been grouped together and what makes each particular segment different from the other groups that we have. Something I should have said maybe a bit earlier, but you don't have to use all of your data when you're building the segmentation. Quite often we'll split our data into different groups. So the overall number of customers will for example, split down into 50-50, one for building the segment, the other one for testing and evaluating the segmentation. In addition, when it comes to variables, we might decide we're only going to use 10 to 15 variables to build the segments, but all of the other variables we're going to use to profile the segments so that we can use that to describe what the segments look like. And so we'll hold back quite a bit of data from the actual building process to allow us to do the profiling. And in terms of the profiling, we chuck as much data at that as we possibly can. And there's, again, a bit of an art and a science here. So the science, you know, for example, if you look at these 3 groups on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see which variables are the ones that come out with the green. So therefore the ones that are highly indexed in those, and then the reds, which are lower indexed. That starts to give us a bit of a description about that segment. But you also then have to take into account, well, what makes this group different from the other groups that I've got? So there's a little bit of artistic license, I guess, would be the right thing to say in terms of ensuring that you bring in all of the data that you've got to allow you to be a bit creative in terms of how you go about building the profile of your individual segments. Once those profiles are created, the other things that we look to do are create pen portraits and give them some names. And this is a really important point when it comes to adoption of the segmentation as well. It's a really good way at this point to get as many people involved in the sort of naming, the describing, the persona creation as you can do. So we might be working with a bit of the business, which is more sort of data scientists or data science team. At this point, we would want to bring in the marketing people, the PR people, the comms people, the customer service people, even the other agencies that get worked with on the creative side or media side to help to sort of get them involved in helping to describe the segments, but also challenging a bit in terms of why have these groups been created, And how do we know these are the right groups to have in place? But that really helps when it comes to adoption. There's nothing better than hearing people saying when they're talking about a segment, oh yeah, that's my segment, that's the one that I created. It makes them feel part of the process. It makes them feel part of the sort of like ownership of this when it starts to get rolled out across the business. So I'm very conscious that I've made all of this sound quite complicated, and I don't want anyone to go away thinking that this is far too big a project for them to do. There's a lot to be considered, but any decent data agency would ensure that you're led through that process, or indeed you'll have people internally who've done this kind of work before that can lead you through it. If you are going to do all of the work internally yourself, then don't fear. It's fine for you to tackle this one stage at a time. You know, work out why you're doing it, what type of segmentation, get the techie people involved to build it, and then the analysis, the naming and the rolling out and such like. It can be done, it's fairly straightforward. It might feel like there's a lot to pick off, but actually there's a lot, you know, there's a lot that you can do, even with a very small database. There are a few other things that I haven't really covered that I think probably should bear in mind. Clearly, data is always going to be key, and making sure the data you have is clean, up to date, and is formatted for use is really important. We only really want to segment the customers that we're interested in. So you might want to take out people who have deceased or those who are old customers who've lapsed quite a long time ago, to make sure that what we're working with are the people that we actually want to look at. Similarly, when it's on data itself, it's important to look at the data you have, whether and whether you need to add more. For example, a psychographic segmentation is probably going to need a survey to be done in general. There's always going to be some modeling or transformation type work done or infilling of missing data. You might also want to look at external third-party data, for example, to supplement the data you've got if you feel that the amount of data you got isn't enough to build the segmentation. And so there's quite a lot of time needs to be invested within the data prep. And our sort of rule of thumb on that is that there should be at least as much time on the preparation of the data as there is on the modeling and the development of the segments themselves. And just to give a bit of an example, we're often asked about how segmentation impacts loyalty, either in conjunction with a loyalty scheme or as part of a loyalty program, or even just building loyalty to a brand through better communications. And this is quite a good example of the different types of segmentation and why it's driven by purpose. So both Sarah and Zoe are very similar in lots of ways: age, income, occupation, etc. So demographic segmentation would group them together. But when we look at their online activity, and here we're looking at their social activity, we can see they behave very differently. So behavioral segmentation would start to pull them apart, and then make it easier for us to sell different products or to build loyalty with them. So from a loyalty perspective, we want to ensure that we're using the right mechanics to engage, to incentivize, and to reward. So here, for example, we need to ensure that we're using the demographics, but also the behavior to create our segments. And loyalty can become much more complex as you add in different levels. At the core of loyalty for me is all about personalization, and segmentation helps massively on that. Retailers in particular really don't, in my view, a lot of retailers really don't grasp the opportunities that are presented through personalization. I hope I don't upset anyone by mentioning White Stuff, but I buy a lot of stuff from White Stuff, and they always send me and my wife exactly the same emails, always with the same leading product, and 99% of the time that's generally women's clothing, despite the fact that they know what I buy, how often I buy, they know my age, they've taken some time to gather a bit of data from me. It would be very similar for them to use that data to tailor their emails, even just as simple as adding a name, which still a whole load of people don't do in terms of personalization, and gender, to pick out a good segmentation or a very good starting point from a segmentation point of view. Then they can maybe add something about spend and recency, and without much extra effort, they could have a very nice personalized experience going. As it is at the moment, I find it a bit bland, a bit annoying, and I'm sure somewhere someone is saying to them that it works, but actually think how much more you would spend or one would spend if they were doing better in terms of segmenting. So when it comes to loyalty, segmentation can be very important to help decide what type of loyalty scheme to put in place, what kind of rewards, what kind of incentives, what kind of communications, which channels to use, and all of the sort of key dynamics around that. And you can look at behaviors in terms of what people are actually doing so that you can decide how to reward them or how to build that loyalty engagement. So finally, because I'm very conscious of time, before I pick up on a couple of examples, I just wanted to pick up some common mistakes as to why segmentation projects occasionally fail. As I've said a few times, the single most important thing is getting the why right. Why do I want to segment my base in the first place? What am I going to do differently as a consequence of it? That to me dictates so much of what is done next. Get that wrong, and often the segmentation will fail. Next, we need to ensure that we get the data right. Anything built on dodgy data is like a house built on sand. It's not going to stand up over time and it's going to fall apart. We need to be practical. As I mentioned earlier, we need to mix art with science and make sure we choose a segmentation that is usable and understandable. That might feel a bit basic to begin with, but allows us to have something as a basis for us to grow and develop over time. And get other areas of the business involved. Adoption is crucial, and our advice is always that you do that as early as you can. That might be even as upfront as when we're defining why we're segmenting in the first place, but at the very least it should be when we're describing, naming and profiling the segments, which is a key part of the solution. So over the years, when we here at Red Group, we've built quite a lot of different segmentations for different types of clients. And I've got a couple of examples of segmentation solutions here. I won't touch on the one in the top left-hand side because that actually happens to be Ageas, which Graham's going to talk about in a bit. The one in the bottom left-hand corner here is actually for an online dating website. That was very much demographic and values driven. The values we gathered through social media. And so we built the segmentation based around how the individuals were engaging with the website and how they were and what they were like as individuals in terms of their demographics. We then took quite a lot of the data, matched that into social media, looked at the behaviors and the motivations, and then refined the segmentation around those motivations. So you might have two different groups who looked very similar in terms of age and income and how they've engaged with the website. But the thing that differentiated them was that one was looking for some fun and some company and a few good nights out, whereas the other group was looking for a long-term partner and someone to spend their life with. And so that pulling apart of those segments using the motivational data gave us a bit more insight in terms of what we could do next. The key thing for that organization was about conversion and the ability to rise conversion from people that tried for free to people that paid. And being able to look at the motivations as to why they were on there in the first place allowed us to basically tailor the communications after they signed up for free to drive the conversion process much better. And a very small increase in conversion makes a lot of money for websites like this. So it didn't take much for that to become a very useful project. You've got Moonpig up in the top right-hand corner there. This was really an evolutionary segmentation, one that started with an RFE, developed into an RFE plus behavior, which created 5 key segments for them. So not particularly many segments, 5 was enough to allow them to start to differentiate their message, differentiate the product offering. These ranged from people who bought a lot and quite often, but who were older, where the key thing was about retention, through to people in the middle who only bought occasionally, but always spent a great deal of money because they'd forgotten to buy a gift for the person they were buying the card for. And so there was different strategies tailored for each of these different groups, and in some cases actually resulted in creation of new products as well. We then extended that into the size of market, and then again from beyond the market size into who are the people that are not buying from Moonpig and why are they not buying from them. So we ended up eventually with creating an overall segmentation of the whole card buying market, if you like, in terms of what they could do. And then the bottom right-hand side is so much more simple, but again, very effective, which is just basically an RFE type segmentation for an online retailer. But again, that allowed them to look at spend by different types of customers, and therefore they could tailor the communications, tailor the acquisition around those different types of individuals. And then there's a few more examples here, but I'm conscious that we're we're kind of getting to the end of my time, so I'm going to skip over these. Just one thing I would say in here is that some of these examples here are a good demonstration of where internal data and external third-party data is used to create the segments, either by building the segments or, probably more importantly, profiling the segments, adding more detail and allowing us to get under the skin of those particular individuals in a bit more detail. So there we go. So that's a real whistle-stop tour of segmentation, why we do it, how we go about it. I've no doubt I've missed 100 different things as we've been going through that. And if you've got any questions, please drop them into the Q&A box, and we'll pick those up at the end of the session. In the meantime, back over to Dean.
Cool, thanks, Scott. I don't think you can be too hard on the White Company, mate, as someone that regularly and frequently wears a skirt in public, as a Scotsman, of course. But we had a few questions through. We'll save those until the end after we've heard from Graham, but please do keep them coming through. As I said earlier on, I'd like to introduce Graham. Graham is Head of Proposition Growth at Ageas. We've been working with Ageas now for over a decade, but on segmentation for just over 6 years now. And Graham has been the driving force behind its inception and its adoption over the last 6 years, and how that's kind of helped drive more than just customer communication. So Graham, over to you, please, mate.
Thanks, Dean. Yeah, and thanks, Scott. So yeah, good to be here, and thanks for giving us the opportunity to share some of the work that we've done with the team at Red Group. So quick introduction to me and the business that I work for. So I'll start with Ageas. For those of you who don't know who we are, we're one of the UK's biggest insurance companies. We trade through brokers and with direct brands. We're the UK's 5th biggest car insurer as it stands today, I think, in terms of policy count, and we're headquartered out of Belgium, so we've got quite a big European presence and Asian as well, so quite a big global group, and our UK presence is chiefly through brokers and direct brands. I head up the propositions and growth function within the distribution team, and have held a number of different analytical roles over the years. So part of the role I hold today includes looking after our customer database, customer profile and customer understanding, hence the focus on segmentation. So that's a quick bit about me and who I work for. If you move us on to the next slide, what I was going to start with is our exam question as to why we wanted a segmentation model and why we ultimately approached Red Group for this. So I think Scott's talked quite eloquently there about, you know, having a really clear use case or set of use cases in mind for segmentation models. When we built this one, we had previously had segmentation models in the business, but they'd never really built the momentum that we'd wanted. They were probably more kind of for reporting or for information, if that makes sense. So when we set out in the early conversations with the team at Red, it was really around kind of building out a set of use cases and reasons that we wanted to develop a segmentation model. So we had to say what from it, if that makes sense. And just to give you a few examples that noted on the page here, historically, when we were looking to produce this model, we were predominantly, particularly from a direct brand perspective, focused on older cohorts within the UK market. So one of our lead brands was a kind of an over 50 specialist insurer, and we recognised the opportunity to broaden our footprint into wider segments. So, you know, we obviously only had data on our own existing customers. We didn't have any data on that wider market, and obviously Red Group have you know, some fairly impressive data assets. So it was around understanding the kind of the wider market, and that was really to drive a number of things. It's obviously, as you can see listed here, everything from kind of brand and proposition strategy, what product enhancements or new products we might need to develop to attract and retain different cohorts of customers that we didn't necessarily trade with at the time. Understanding the kind of the marketing approach and how to personalize, and Scott talked about that to good effect earlier. You know, how do we treat our customers as individuals as best we can? So moving towards a more segmented and personalized communication approach, and ultimately as well trying to develop some new insights into our customers beyond that of just, you know, a fairly binary age variable descriptor. So developing a richness of understanding around our consumers, who they were, and some of the preferences and attitudes that they exhibit, if that makes sense. So that was the why. And what we wanted to do. And ultimately, Scott and his team built, in collaboration with the data science team that I managed at the time, a segmentation model that ultimately manifested in 10 market segments, which I think if you turn over the page will be visible to the people here. But ultimately, what we developed here was an outside-in segmentation model. So it was a combination of, sort of demographic, attitudinal variables, but ultimately at its heart, it was an insurance-specific segmentation model. So importantly, included things like product holdings, and obviously that helped us really understand at a macro level, from a UK consumer perspective, what are the different segments that exist within the market from an insurance perspective, and what are the sorts of product holdings that they have. So to give you an example, at the sort of the segment one end, the younger consumers, insurance product penetration is lower. Those customers are just setting out, so they might be in the new first time buyer space, or just learning to drive and that sort of stuff, right the way through to some of the kind of middle-aged mass market segments where product holdings is quite broad, quite dense, and therefore you've got greater cross-sell potential, as an example. So it was an outside-in segmentation. It was built on Red's database, and ultimately then the important thing we wanted to do is be able to join that back into our own data then. So the 10 segment model you see here is the ultimate manifestation of what Red Group built, and then working with our branding and design team, and this was quite an important stage of the process, we developed these out into what were effectively top trumps, and that kind of landed quite well in terms of trying to humanize and bring the what is quite a data intensive process to bear for a wider business of people who aren't maybe as data literate as some of the data scientists within our team. So we even got to the point where we printed top trump decks of cards, and people around the business had them as kind of visual aids, if that makes sense, to help really bring it to life. But once you built the segmentation, and you can see from some of the narrative on the right, there's some of the composition variables that make up that segmentation model. We had a good sense of what the UK market looked like by these segments, and what the distribution of the UK population looked like. The important thing we then wanted to do is understand where our customers sat against that segmentation model. So we scored our entire base up at a segment level to generate some fresh insights, and quite useful information, as you could imagine, in terms of understanding where our brands currently played. Which segments we over-indexed in relative to the UK population, where there were areas where we were very heavily underrepresented and presented some growth opportunities, if that makes sense. So that was kind of the initial sort of light bulb moment, understanding where we play today, at an overall level. What have we done since then, and how have we used it over the years? Probably more ways than I can bring to life in the next 3 or 4 minutes that I've got, but some examples were within propositional development. So we use the segmentation in terms of some of our product and proposition design, and also influencing and informing our brand strategy for some of our direct portfolio, as an example. Scott talked in detail about personalising of communication. So we also worked with Red and did some of the kind of social media matching to get a sense of, some of the kind of consumer attitudes and motivations and the like. We use that to influence some of our communication strategies in terms of timings, but also the content that we serve, to try and make the content as personalised as possible to those different cohorts. And also, even as recently as 2 weeks ago, actually, for our group board, with the Belgian HQ, was doing some profiling of our overall UK portfolio of customers by segment, to generate some insight, to kind of give some insights into where we currently play at a more macro level than maybe just our direct brand. So there's a number of different use cases, different applications that we've used over the years, and obviously we're now in a position with Scott and with Dean at the team of exploring where we take this next, and what are the next opportunities to develop this segmentation model out. It's worth noting as well, I think that Scott made the point earlier as to I think in his first iteration when he was at the bank, 100 odd segments, and one of the examples he gave recently, there were 5 segments. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer as to how many segments you would need. I think probably something manageable if you are starting out in segmentation is probably a sensible guide. We do in our model have 25 micro segments that sit beneath these 10, but apart from a few kind of discrete use cases, we've generally not dipped below the 10 segments in the past, because we feel for the applications within our business that we've needed them for, that 10 is generally enough. But where we need a bit more sort of delineation, we've maybe gone down to those sub-segments, if that makes sense. So in terms of what next and where we're going, as I think I mentioned before, we're starting to look at this again from a more strategic perspective. So one of the things we're looking at is kind of portfolio analysis, and at a macro level in a UK business, where are the pockets of opportunity, and where are the areas that we might look to develop into further through our different channels. I think from the perspective of the pandemic, what we've seen as an example is a resurgence in some segments of consumers coming back into the market. So, a good example would be in segment one, where, for 2 or so years of lockdown, and even now, the fallout from that, young drivers, delays to driving lessons, passing your test, and that sort of thing. So there's been a resurgence in the market of younger consumers who are coming back in now and passing their test, albeit maybe a few years older than they would have done when they maybe turned 17. So there's a lot of work we're looking to do now in terms of the portfolio analysis, and we're also refreshing some work that we've done previously, which I hadn't mentioned, which is then matching this into our kind of profitability and lifetime value models. So as I said before, we can match every one of our customers down to a segment level. What we're now also taking that to the level of is understanding, again, from a profitability point of view, which segments are maybe more or less profitable for us, and within that, does that influence then who and where we target, but also those that are maybe less profitable, what are the dynamics or the things that make that the case. And so kind of taking it to that next level of strategic insight, if you like, is really where we're focused at the moment. So yeah, it's a project that over 6 years has taken many different forms, but yeah, it's still in use within the business today, so as relevant now as it was when we first built it. I think that's probably the summary that I wanted to give. Obviously quite a whistle stop tour of what we've done, why we did it, and where we're going next, and I'll hand back over to Dean and Scott.
Thanks, Graham. It's really really insightful. I find when people talk about segmentation and customer segmentation, you get quite insular and very kind of focused on your existing customers, and potentially augment that with some additional third party. But what's really quite inspiring about your case is that you flipped it on its head and did a national segmentation, and then overlaid your customers onto that, which is a smart way of approaching it, and has a whole myriad of benefits, like you said, in terms of penetration and targeting and headroom and so on. So it's it's good. One of the questions I had, though, is clearly it's worked and has been progressive over the last 6 years. How did you, and you touched on a couple of bits about the top trumps and bringing marketing and branding along for the ride, but what have you done to make it as successful from its adoption and uses off the back of that? So from day one, so to speak.
Yeah, good question. So I think a couple of ways to answer that. First of all, I think from a business application, and what are the questions you want to set out to answer. So the first bit we did when we built this was we were really explicit and clear that this was designed to be a marketing segmentation. So it's sat originally within the marketing team, which now sits within that broader distribution function that I mentioned. But we are not an island, and we work quite closely with our pricing, underwriting, and operational colleagues. So there was a stage in terms of being really clear and upfront that this was around, chiefly marketing applications, but also had the potential to, broaden out into other areas. So canvassing and getting inputs from those other teams in terms of their requirements was quite a key one, I think, in terms of developing out the buy-in. And then I think within that as well, just being really clear and obviously honest as well about the things that segmentation can do and the things that it can't do. So as part of that conversation, in insurance world, and with the granularity of data and pricing, an underwriting team or a pricing team will price based on segments of one, and all of the the hundreds of data points that exist around consumers today. So it's recognizing the applications, but also being really clear with them around the limitations. So I think if you were trying to create a model that is business wide, and ours has business wide applications, then it's doable, but probably just being really clear about the use cases and the things that it can, and being really clear about the things it can't do and being quite honest about that is quite important, I think.
I guess focus on the key reasons why you're undertaking that project in the first place, and then roll out buy-in and additional use cases over time.
Indeed, yeah.
Okay. So I guess, I don't know if that's a question for you or Scott, but there's quite a number of tools at a marketeer's disposal, from segmentation, models, or even geodemographic tools available. Where do you think segmentation fits alongside those?
Do you want me to pick that up, Graham?
Take that one, Ian. I'm happy to.
As I said earlier, the geodemographic tools like Mosaic and Acorn and such like are in themselves segmentation solutions. And I think, you know, if you're struggling to build a segmentation for yourself, they're not a bad place to go to help you to break down your customers, profile your customers, look at the different groups. I think the thing to always bear in mind is that they're built as generic solutions, so they have to cover every particular use case, which is why in a lot of cases they've got 50 plus different segments, because they're trying to cover everyone in the country for every purpose. Whereas an actual segmentation for yourself is obviously targeted on what your use case is going to be. And then, you know, we have used things like Mosaic in describing some of the segmentations that we build, for example, because it's a nice, easy way to summarize smaller groups, and the two can work hand in hand. There's no reason why they can't do. I mean, similarly, we often get asked about segmentation versus predictive modeling. And for me, the two things are slightly different. You know, predictive modeling is about trying to find a particular outcome or likely outcome in the future based on something that's happened in the past. And we'll often put the segmentation segments into the predictive models because the segments are going to basically behave in different ways. And so again, the two things can work hand in hand. I think it can potentially become a bit confusing if you've got a predictive model, which is about who's going to respond to campaigns, and then you've got a segmentation system sitting in the background. But often what we'll do is the selection as to who to mail or who to email or who to target on social will come from the predictive model, but then how to do that and what the right creative treatment is, what the right messaging will come from the segmentation system. You know, so they can definitely coexist. There's no doubt about it. It's about using the right thing for the right purpose ultimately.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, just, I mean, exact example of that, when we first built the segmentation model, we were then building some predictive models looking at likelihood to churn and lapse at renewal. The segment was one of the more predictive variables, it turned out. So, you know, that in itself was quite insightful. The different segments will behave in different ways. And then obviously, so you've got then a kind of a prediction in terms of what someone's action is likely to be. And obviously then the ability to overlay the segment to then personalize the communication that has that interaction was another thing that we built out. So.
Yeah, I guess it's not that surprising, is it, Graham? I mean, if you were building a predictive model and you had hundreds of variables, the first thing you do is build some factor analysis to reduce those variables down to something manageable. Yeah. The segments really are, you know, good factor analysis models that summarize quite a lot of the variables for you very quickly.
Yeah.
So we covered off, and Graham, you covered off a number of segments and making sure the number of segments are manageable and usable. What's your update frequency at the moment for your segmentation?
So
or what do you think it should?
Do you mean in terms of a full-on refresh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, good question. You're testing me now. We've refreshed it, I think, twice in the last 6 years. Scott's nodding, so that's right. That's good. So I think, one of the conversations I was Scott only last week was whether it's due another refresh, because I think the last one we did was probably just pre-pandemic, and I think, potentially that's likely to have maybe shifted things. So again, I think, probably work with, whether it's Red or your data agency or your in-house team to kind of get a sense as to when you think is a sensible time to do it. I remember some of my data scientists working with Scott in the past, and we got to a place where we felt, I think it was a refresh was due by product, the fact that we were looking at some of the, when you dig into the types of customers that sit within a segment 5 or a segment 7, and it started to not necessarily feel quite right, and it wasn't that we'd suddenly skewed massively. So I think that's the whole point around applying the kind of human eye to the data, what the data is telling you as well. So I mean, I don't think there's a golden rule, but yeah, we've typically refreshed it probably with a frequency of every couple of years, and probably do another one now, I think.
Yeah, I guess that's through a lens of potentially a changing audience with that as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. That's the case. And in fairness, I mean, we used to refresh and not refresh the model, but we used to kind of assign people to a segment on a daily basis. So our marketing database on a daily refresh, we had a kind of an overnight scoring, which meant that any customer that joined yesterday, we knew the next day, and we could therefore personalize accordingly. We know some of the use cases we have now, and the shift we've had as a business in terms of some of our strategy means we don't need to do that frequency of refresh. But yeah, I mean, if you've got the ability to score your customers in near real time, or even day behind latency, then you've got that personalization capability at your fingertips much quicker.
Sure. Yeah, and there is a difference, isn't there, Graham, between how often you update people's segment and how often you update the segments. Over time, people change. We get older. I was going to say we get wealthier, but at the moment no one's getting wealthier. But you know, there are changes to our demographics. You get married, you take out new products, so people will move between segments.
Yeah.
The question is when you have to change the segments because people have moved. You know, if you go on a big acquisition trail, which you did at Ageas, for example, you know, looking to acquire new types of people, then clearly that's going to change the nature of the segmentation over time, and so it probably feeds into having to rebuild the segments. One of the things we were quite conscious of, wasn't it, Graham, is that the adoption had been very strong, so we didn't want to change the names or the makeup of the segments too much, because it would kind of upset what people were used to seeing and using. And so we've kind of tweaked the segmentation rather than doing an entirely new segmentation every couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely that. And I think your point around, you know, demographic shifts and behavior shifts and things, I think, you know, one of the things I'm mindful of, and I talked about, you know, the younger segment, you know, if we look at it, how historically a new driver in the market was a 17-year-old just got their provisional license and they were looking for insurance. And now most of the young drivers coming into the market and passing their test are probably 19 or 20, because, you know, they've got, you know, 2 years of COVID where they've not been able to learn, and then, you know, the backlog of tests and that sort of stuff. So that's a very different, you know, if I think back to, you know, when you're 17 versus when you're 20 or 21, quite different attitudinally and behaviourally probably, and judge what you will about my driving behaviour back then. But yeah, that sort of is a different kind of mindset and customer. And similarly, at the older end of the spectrum, you know, when we built the segmentation model, that was pre-pandemic and pre the forced acceleration in digital adoption that older consumers have now made. And so, you know, there's an element of and to be proven through the work that we'll do with Scott. But, you know, at the two extreme ends of our segmentation model, how relevant are they today in terms of how the pandemic's affected those two? And within the middle of that, there's all sorts of other things that will naturally come to play. So.
Sure. Okay. Maybe it's a tough question, but maybe one for you on that one then, Scott. You mentioned machine learning earlier. How do you think that's going to impact approach to customer segmentations when machine learning can build predictive pathways for individuals?
Well, as I've kind of said previously, our ultimate aim is to create a bespoke journey or a bespoke communication strategy for each individual. I mean, that would be, you know, where everyone would want to be, I guess, in terms of brands, whether you're a charity or a financial services company or a retailer. And there's no doubt that machine learning, AI, leads us down to being a more likely thing. I still think we're quite far off that being the case. I mean, maybe people will correct me after this session and give me some examples of where people are using those tools and techniques to actually drive individual level comms plans. But for me, I think the segmentation side of things still becomes really important, because you're feeding that in as one of the variables to help you to develop those plans. So I think machine learning contributes in two ways. One, there's no doubt it helps to build better segments, better segmentations, because there's more power and more capability there to allow us to do that. I still personally believe you need the human eye to split out that science from the art, if you like, in terms of which segmentation is the best one to select to use for an organization. But I think where machine learning can become even more powerful is in the deployment and actually feeding stuff in to allow us to detect changes. So, for example, if someone's online looking at particular products, you know, by feeding in this type of segment, looks at these types of people, and then changing that based on what's actually happening in real time, that starts to get us closer to that sort of one-to-one personalized experience effectively. And, you know, if you tie that up to things like chatbots and such like, then who knows where that can end up, but it could become really powerful. Sure.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much, both. So I think we don't have any more questions from anyone in the audience. So if we wrap up, if you could just push us forward then, Scott. So in terms of, if you could all, as I said at the start, try and make this as interactive as possible. If you've enjoyed it, like, tweet, or follow up accordingly on LinkedIn and such like. Our video will be available, I think, as of tomorrow online, as is the previous webinars we've had. The next webinar we've got is on the 12th of October, which is for focus on GDPR. And so once again, Graham, thank you very much for your time. Always very insightful when we catch up. It's great. Scott, thank you very much. And thank you everyone else for joining. And we look forward to speaking to you soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dean. Thank you. Cheers.